The candles in the great hall of Ashvale burned 3 deep along every window ledge, and their light fell across silk and satin, and the particular confidence of women who had never once wondered whether they belonged in a room. It was the first night of December, and the snow had come in earnest at 6 o'clock, and every carriage that turned through the park gates had delivered another arrangement of jewels and feathers and carefully constructed futures into the warm and blazing interior of the season's most scrutinized ball. Cecily stood near the far wall in a gown that had been retrimmed twice, and a gray wool cloak she had not yet relinquished to the footman, because she had not yet decided whether she would stay. She had been 23 years old for exactly 11 days, and no one at Ashvale knew it, and no one would have counted it a distinction if they had. From across the room, a man stood still in a way that the rest of the assembly did not. He was 31 years old, and tall enough that the candlelight caught the planes of his face before it reached the people around him, and his jaw was set in the manner of someone who had learned long ago to let rooms talk around him without requiring his participation. Cecily did not see him watching her. She was occupied, at that precise moment, with the small and necessary work of becoming invisible, which was the skill she had spent the better part of her 23 years perfecting. What she did not yet know was that it had already failed. She had come to the winter ball at Ashvale because her brother Silas had asked her to come, and asking was the only currency Silas had left since the debt had taken the rest. £420. She had read the sum from a solicitor's letter that arrived on a Tuesday, folded in thirds, unsealed at one corner, as though it had reconsidered its own news, and could not quite commit. The debt was real. The season was real. The ball was real. And so she had put on the better of her 2 remaining evening gowns, retrimmed the bodice with a strip of white ribbon that had previously ornamented something else, and she had come. Lady Dorothea Ivanov, Dowager Duchess of Ashvale, stood at the center of the room's highest orbit with the bearing of a woman who had been the fixed point of every significant gathering in this county for 32 years, and she intended to remain so. Her jewels were the ones painted in the family portraits. Her posture was a sentence that needed no verb. Beside her stood Miss Arabella Fenn, 20 years old, and the precise shade of brilliant that the season demanded, her diamonds catching the light at measured intervals as though they too had been rehearsed. The dowager's gaze moved across the room with the practiced economy of a general surveying terrain, and when it landed on Cecily, it paused for one brief cold moment. "The Hartwell girl," she said, not quietly enough, to the woman at her right elbow. "A provincial, and the family owes half the county besides. She ought not to have been invited at all." The woman at her right elbow said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Cecily heard it. She kept her face composed and her eyes directed toward the window, where the snow was still coming down against the dark, steady, and indifferent, and entirely without opinion about what she was worth. She was preparing to locate her cloak again when the room shifted. It was not a sound exactly, and not a movement, but a quality of attention that changed around a single point, and that point was moving in her direction. She became aware of it the way one becomes aware of a change in temperature before the cause is visible, the air itself delivering the news. She looked up. The Duke of Ashvale was crossing the room, not toward Arabella Fenn, who watched him come with a smile already arranged on her face. Not toward the cluster of senior peers near the fireplace, who tracked his movement with the peripheral awareness that rank produced instinctively in those around it. He was crossing the room in 3 deliberate, unhurried strides toward the far wall and the woman in the gray wool cloak who was holding a glass of negus she had not tasted. He stopped in front of her. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in rings the way a stone dropped in still water sends its disturbance outward, and the outermost ring had not yet received the news when he said, in a voice calibrated to reach exactly one person, "Miss Hartwell, you are standing in a draft. Come away from the wall." It was not a request. It was also not unkind, though she could not immediately identify what it was instead. She stared at him for a moment longer than propriety permitted, searching his face for the error, the misidentification, the social obligation she could not yet locate, that would explain why the Duke of Asheville had crossed his own ballroom to speak to a woman in a retrimmed gown and a wool cloak. His face offered her nothing. His eyes were the color of smoke over winter fields, and they were entirely steady, and they were entirely upon her. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I believe I am quite comfortable where I am." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile, or not precisely a smile, but it was the territory adjacent to one, and it was gone before she could be certain of it. "Come away from the wall," he said again. She came away from the wall. She could not have explained afterward why she obeyed. She told herself it was simply less conspicuous than refusing, which was partly true, and not the whole truth. The whole truth was that something in his voice had sounded less like a command than like a door opened. She did not know yet what was on the other side of it. He did not speak to her at length. He did not single her out again that evening with any gesture that could have been precisely named or repeated in a drawing room as evidence. He positioned himself, briefly, between her and the dowager's direct line of sight, and then he moved on, and the room exhaled, and Lady Dorothea recovered her expression and turned the full warmth of her attention back toward Arabella Fenn, who accepted it with a grace that had been very carefully cultivated. Cecily retrieved her cloak from the footman at the end of the evening and went home in the dark in Silas's borrowed carriage, and told herself that the Duke of Asheville had simply been navigating his own room and happened to correct her placement as he passed, the way a man of his precise temperament would correct any minor disorder in his household. She told herself this quite firmly, and almost believed it, and lay awake for a longer time than she would have wished, examining the quality of his attention. The invitation to stay at Asheville for the fortnight came 4 days later. It was addressed to Silas, as invitations of practical social consequence always were, and it included, in careful language, the suggestion that his sister might benefit from the society of the season's remaining events if she were to be housed conveniently nearby rather than making the 7-mile journey each evening in uncertain weather. Silas read it aloud at the breakfast table with an expression that moved between relief and something more complicated, and Cecily looked at the letter in his hand and understood that for Silas, with £420 outstanding, and the season's goodwill the only remaining negotiable asset, the answer was not in question. She packed both evening gowns and the gray cloak, and arrived at Asheville on a Wednesday morning when the frost had silvered every visible surface, and the house was very large and very quiet in the particular way of places that had once held more life than they currently did. Mrs. Prewitt received her. The housekeeper was a compact woman of perhaps 55 years, with a face that had been rearranged by a great deal of practical experience into something close to equanimity, and she showed Cecily to a room in the east wing with the efficiency of a person who had observed the arrivals and departures of many guests and held firm opinions about which of them were worth the household's linen. The room was small and well-ordered, and looked out over the kitchen garden, which was buried in snow and entirely without pretension. "The family rooms are on the upper floor," Mrs. Prewitt told her. "The drawing room is open to guests between the hours of 10 and 4. Dinner is at 7. His Grace dines at home on Tuesdays and Fridays." She paused at the door. The nursery wing is on the 3rd floor at the far end of the east corridor. The children's staff have been reduced to 1 girl this past year. Master Thomas takes his meals in his room. Cecily had unpacked her 2nd gown and was smoothing the ribbon at its hem. "Master Thomas?" she said. "His Grace's ward," Mrs. Prewett said. 6 years old. The household has not quite known what to do with him." She said it without cruelty, in the tone of a woman reporting a weather condition. Then she left. Cecily did not set out that first afternoon with any particular intention. She was simply walking the length of the east corridor to familiarize herself with the house, as any sensible guest would, and the door to the nursery wing was ajar, and the sound from behind it was one that she recognized without being able to name immediately. The specific quality of a child who has been silent long enough that silence had become the shape of the room around him. She knocked. She went in. Thomas was sitting on the floor beside the cold fireplace, with the precise posture of a child who has learned that occupying very little space is a form of safety. He was small for 6 years old, with dark eyes and hands that were too still, and he looked at her with the particular wariness of someone who has received many departures and very few arrivals that held. On the floor beside him was a small painted wooden horse, bay-colored, one ear chipped, cradled in both his hands with the care of a person holding the one constant thing. "Hello?" Cecily said. Cecily. She sat down on the floor, which she understood would require a considerable time with a clothes brush afterward, and she did not let this concern alter her expression. "I was looking for the window that faces east. I have been told it has a very fine view." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "This room faces north," he said. "That is extremely useful information," Cecily said. "I shall have to look further. Shall I read something while I am here, so my errand is not entirely wasted?" He did not say yes. He did not say no. He moved the wooden horse 1 inch closer to his knee, which she interpreted correctly as permission. She found a volume of natural history on the shelf above the cold fireplace, the kind that described the habits of various birds in the language of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors and wished everyone else to share the enthusiasm, and she read it aloud in a voice that did not perform enthusiasm but simply inhabited it, the way she had read to herself since she was a child, and the library at her father's house had been the best room in a diminishing world. She returned the following afternoon, and the afternoon after that. On the 4th afternoon, she was 3 chapters into a different volume, one that concerned the migratory patterns of swallows, when she became aware of something in the corridor beyond the door she had left half open. Not a sound, precisely. A quality of attention. The same quality she had registered across the Ashvale ballroom 6 days ago. She did not look up. She kept reading, her voice the same as it had been, the word on the page the same. Thomas was watching a picture of a swallow with the focused intensity he brought to images of animals, and he did not notice. She kept reading. After perhaps 5 minutes, the presence in the corridor withdrew, as quietly as it had arrived. That evening, at dinner, the Duke of Ashvale said nothing beyond the ordinary forms of host and guest. He was seated at the far end of a table that seated 20 and currently held 9, and the distance between them was both physical and social, and entirely appropriate. Cecily watched him receive a question from Lord Pemberton on his right and answer it in 3 sentences, no more. And she thought about the corridor, and she ate her soup, and she said nothing. What she did not know, and what she would not learn until much later, was what the corridor had cost him. The nursery wing had been closed for 4 years, not locked, not forbidden in any formal sense, but closed in the way that grief closes rooms, not by decree, but by the accumulation of small, deliberate avoidances that eventually produce the same effect as a lock. Richard had been 31 years old for 3 months when his son had lived for 3 days and died. And the room that had been prepared for the child had been quietly emptied by the household's careful servants, and Richard had never given instructions about Thomas when the boy arrived after the will was read, because giving instructions would have required him to go to that wing of the house and stand in the corridor where the air still held the particular quality of careful, useless preparation. He had not been able to do it. So Thomas had had his meals in his room, and one reduced member of staff, and very little else. And Richard had known this, and had not known how to unmake it. He had heard the reading from the top of the stairs. He had stood in the corridor for 5 full minutes, listening to a woman's voice describe the migratory patterns of swallows to a 6-year-old boy who, by the quality of his silence, was entirely absorbed. He had not gone in. He had stood in a corridor he had not stood in for 4 years, and the door had been half open, and the light from inside it had fallen across the floor in a warm, narrow strip, and something in his chest had shifted position with a precision that felt almost like pain, and almost like its opposite. He had not spoken to her at dinner. He had not known what to say that would not be too much, and saying too much was not in his nature, and so he had said nothing. And she had looked at her soup with the composure of a woman who was accustomed to being overlooked, and he had watched her, and she had not known he was watching. And the evening had ended with the distance between them perfectly intact. His mother arrived at Ashvale the following morning. Lady Dorothea traveled with the efficiency of a military operation. 3 carriages, her personal dresser, and a complete understanding of the social landscape she was entering. She assessed the guest list at luncheon with a practiced eye, allocated her warmth in the precise gradations that the season required, and arrived at Cecily's end of the table with an expression that contained, beneath its surface of polished civility, the specific quality of a woman who has already made a decision and is in the process of executing it. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "how very diligent of you to come all this way for the season." The word diligent carried, in Lady Dorothea's voice, a precise weight of condescension that managed to be both technically complimentary and thoroughly diminishing, the way a person might describe a house with a leaking roof as showing character. Cecily set down her fork. "You are very kind, Lady Dorothea," she said, with the composure she had been practicing since she was old enough to understand that composure was sometimes the only available form of resistance. The Dowager moved on, but Arabella Fenn, seated at the Dowager's immediate left, glanced at Cecily with a look that contained no malice and a great deal of involuntary pity, which was in some respects worse. If you have been finding yourself caught in this story, you are not alone. Stories like this one tend to find the listeners who need them most. Do stay close, because the distance between Cecily and what she cannot yet allow herself to hope is about to become the most consequential gap in the room. The following 3 days accumulated evidence the way snow accumulates, each flake individually insignificant and collectively irresistible. Richard crossed the library 2 steps out of his direct path to retrieve a book from the upper shelf that Cecily had been reaching for and could not quite reach, and handed it to her without comment. He arrived at the morning room doorway at the precise moment a junior footman was explaining to Cecily, with misplaced authority, that the East Garden Walk was closed to guests in wet weather, and he said, "It is not," in a voice that ended the conversation. He asked her, at dinner on Friday, whether her room was warm enough, and the question was addressed to her alone, and lasted 3 words. And she answered that it was perfectly adequate, and his eyes held hers for 1 moment, before he turned back to the general conversation. None of these things could be named as evidence in any court that the season recognized. She named them, instead, in the private court of her own interior, and dismissed each one in turn, and returned to the evidence of her position. 2 retrimmed gowns, a brother with £420 in outstanding debt, and a dowager who had called her a provincial at the first ball of the season in front of 11 people, who would all remember it. She was in the nursery on the 5th afternoon when Mrs. Prewett appeared in the doorway, not entering, only standing at the threshold with her hands folded and her expression carrying something that Cecily had not seen on it before. "Master Thomas's wooden horse," Mrs. Prewett said. "Her ladyship has removed it from the room." Thomas, on the floor with his book, had gone very still in the way of a child who has learned that stillness does not prevent loss, but cannot stop trying. "When?" Cecily said. "This morning." She said the nursery was to be tidied, and that there should be nothing on the floor that was not in its proper place. Cecily looked at Thomas. The space beside his knee where the horse had been was not precisely empty. It was the other thing, the kind of absence that has a shape, that takes up more room than the object it replaced. "Where is it now?" she said. Mrs. Prewett's expression did not change. "The blue salon," she said. "On the mantelpiece, with the other ornaments." Cecily stood up. She smoothed her skirt and looked at Thomas and said, "I shall be back before the chapter is finished." She went downstairs. That evening was the dinner party. 17 guests at the long table, the candles brilliant, the silver polished to its best argument about the standards of the house. Lady Dorothea sat at her son's left hand, and Arabella Fenn sat 3 places along, and Cecily sat near the foot of the table between Lord Pemberton's younger son, who was pleasant and entirely without consequence, and a Mrs. Aldgate, who had strong opinions about the management of kitchen gardens. Cecily was engaged in forming a courteous response to Mrs. Aldgate's views on the espalier system when the dowager's voice, from the upper end of the table, carried cleanly over the intervening conversation. "Provincial connections," Lady Dorothea was saying, to no one in particular, and to the entire table simultaneously, "are all very well in their place, but one does wonder at the wisdom of bringing young ladies to town who have neither the fortune nor the position to sustain a proper season. It does them no kindness in the end. The Hartwell family, for instance, I understand the brother has debts outstanding of a considerable scale." She paused and took a small sip of her wine, and the pause was the sentence's real content. "Poor girl," she added, in the particular tone of a woman who means the opposite. "One hopes she finds a quiet resolution." 17 people were looking at Cecily, some with curiosity, some with the particular comfort people take in a misfortune that is not their own, and 2 or 3 with something that might, in a better world, have been called sympathy. Lord Pemberton's younger son studied his asparagus with sudden devotion. Mrs. Aldgate said nothing and looked at her plate. Richard sat at the head of the table, and Cecily looked at him, and he was looking at his mother, and his face was the still face he wore in public, the face that gave nothing and revealed nothing, and after a moment he looked back down at his own plate and said nothing at all. The silence lasted 4 seconds. It felt longer. Cecily said, "You are very good, Lady Dorothea," in a voice that was perfectly level, and returned her attention to Mrs. Aldgate. And the conversation at the lower end of the table reconstituted itself around them. Slowly, and with the care of people reassembling something that had been dropped. She did not look at Richard again for the rest of the evening. Later that night, she sat at the writing desk in her small east-facing room and worked through the arithmetic that she had been avoiding since the letter arrived. £420. Silas had 2, possibly 3 months before the note came due. The season had not produced and was not likely to produce what the season was supposed to produce, and the Dowager had just said so in front of 17 people, one of whom was the only man in the county whose opinion on the matter would move anything. She began a letter to Silas. She got as far as the salutation, and then sat for a long time looking at the frost forming at the lower edge of the window glass, its slow white geometry entirely indifferent to debt, to seasons, to the particular humiliation of being named a problem to be solved in front of the people whose solution you had been hoping to obtain. She would leave on Friday, she decided. That was the practical thing. And she was a practical woman. And she would go home and help Silas find another way. And the gray cloak would go back on its hook. And the second gown would be retrimmed one more time if the ribbon could bear it. And she would stop reading about swallows to a 6-year-old boy who had learned to be very still as a form of survival, because continuing to read to Thomas was the least practical thing she could imagine, and the one she found most difficult to contemplate surrendering. Thursday morning, she retrieved the wooden horse from the blue salon mantelpiece. She had gone in for a book, which was true enough, and she had stood in front of the fire for a moment. And then she had looked at the mantelpiece where a collection of small ornaments had been arranged with the precise aesthetic authority of a woman who understood that objects, like people, could be placed where they did not quite belong in order to make a point. The wooden horse stood between a Chinese enamel box and a small bronze stag, its chipped ear slightly tilted, its bay paint worn to bare wood along the neck where a small hand had held it very often. She picked it up and put it in her pocket and went upstairs. Thomas was in the window seat when she came in. He had not been reading. He had been looking at the snow with the specific quality of attention that has nothing particular to look at, and is simply filling time until something changes, or does not. She sat down beside him and put the horse on the seat between them, and he looked at it for a moment. And then he picked it up with both hands, and held it in the careful way, and said nothing. "I found it in the blue salon," Cecily said. "It seemed unhappy there." Thomas looked at the horse. "Mrs. Prewett says it belongs to me," he said. "My mother gave it to me." "Then it belongs with you," Cecily said. He turned it once in his hands, his thumb tracing the worn place along the neck. "Are you leaving on Friday?" he said, not looking at her. She had not told him. She had not told anyone. She considered the child beside her, 6 years old and very still, with the horse in his hands and his eyes on the window. And she said, "I was thinking of it," which was honest, and which was all she could give him. He nodded, slowly, and held the horse a little closer, and they sat together in the window for a long time without speaking, while the snow came down over the kitchen garden in the way it had been doing for weeks, steady and patient, and without any requirement for a response. She did not know that Richard had come to the nursery corridor again. He had not announced himself. He had come because Mrs. Prewett had told him, in the plain words that were her only available idiom, that Miss Hartwell had gone to the blue salon that morning and returned something to the child that the child had needed, and that she thought he ought to know. He had stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand not quite on the door frame, and looked at the narrow strip of winter light on the floor, and he had heard the silence of 2 people keeping each other company, without requiring anything of the silence, and he had understood something about what Cecily had done that went past the simple act of returning a toy to its owner. His mother had placed the horse on the mantelpiece as an ornament, which was the vocabulary she spoke when she wanted to make something clear without saying it. Cecily had returned it to the child who held it as the one fixed point in a household that had not known what to do with him. The act had cost her something, because the Dowager would know, and knowing would matter. And doing it anyway was a quality that Richard had not known he was looking for until he saw it and recognized it, with the precision of a man who has spent 4 years in the company of its absence. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor long enough to be certain of what he had understood, and then he went downstairs and said nothing to his mother, and wrote a letter that evening to Lord Ashworth, who was hosting the season's closing ball in 10 days' time. The closing ball of the season was held at Ashworth House on a Saturday in late December. 140 guests in rooms that had been designed for that precise number, the chandeliers lit from stem to last crystal point, the musicians arranged in the upper gallery where the sound would fall in the manner best suited to the architecture. Cecily had decided, after the matter of the wooden horse, that leaving on Friday was still the practical choice, and she had made it twice more in the intervening days, and each time found some reason to remain 1 day longer that she could not entirely account for. By the time Saturday arrived, she was still at Ashville, and she put on the better gown for the last time and the gray cloak over it, and went to the ball because it was the final event of the season, and Silas had asked her to attend, and it seemed important to finish what she had started, even if what she had started had not finished, as she had hoped. Lady Dorothea arrived at the ball in the first carriage. Arabella Fenn arrived in the second, arranged with the precision of a woman who has been told her entire life that the arrangement is correct, and she was correct in every particular of dress and deportment and social positioning, and she had done nothing wrong. And Cecily did not resent her. And this was perhaps the truest measure of what Cecily was. For an hour, nothing happened that was not the ordinary machinery of such an evening. Conversations were had. Cards were exchanged. The punch was adequate, and the music was better. Lady Dorothea held her orbit at the room's social center and was, for an hour, entirely confident, which was the state in which Cecily had most often observed her, and which she had come to understand was not arrogance exactly, but something that had been arrogance for so long it had become infrastructure. The Duke of Ashvale arrived at 9:30. He was announced at the door in the usual form, and the usual quality of attention gathered around his arrival. And he moved through the opening pleasantries with the efficiency of a man who has learned to complete social obligations at speed without sacrificing their appearance of completeness. He spoke to Lord Ashworth. He received Lady Pemberton's welcome. He crossed the room to his mother and bent to exchange a few words that Cecily, at her distance, could not hear. And his mother's expression through those words was the expression of a woman receiving information that she found unexpected and had not yet decided how to classify. Then he turned. And he crossed the room. Not the quick passage of a man navigating a crowd toward a destination that happened to lie in a particular direction. He crossed it with the deliberate, unhurried geometry of a man who knows where he is going and has decided that the room should understand this. Cecily watched him come and felt the cold opening, the same quality of temperature change that she had registered at the winter ball 4 weeks ago. And she did not move, and she did not pretend to look elsewhere, because she was 23 years old and tired of pretending to look elsewhere, and whatever was happening, she intended to meet it with her eyes open. He stopped in front of her. The room had gone quiet in its rings. "Cecily," he said. "Not Miss Hartwell. Not an accident. Her name. Her given name, spoken in the public room where his mother had called her a provincial and a problem. Spoken in a voice that was quiet enough to require the room to be silent, and loud enough that the silence was not a choice. He held out his hand. She looked at his hand, and then at his face. And the face was the still face, except for one thing. His eyes, which were the color of smoke over winter fields, were not still at all. They were the eyes of a man who has opened a door he has been standing outside for 4 years and found, against every reasonable expectation, that there was warmth on the other side. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, which cost her something. "Are you quite certain?" "I have been certain since the nursery corridor," he said. "I was simply not ready to be useful until now." She put her hand in his. The room's silence completed itself. Arabella Fenn, at the upper end of the room, held her glass very carefully and looked at the floor, not with devastation, but with the quiet of someone receiving information that reorganizes a long-held expectation. And she accepted this with a grace that was genuine and not performed, which was perhaps the best that could be said of a difficult moment. The dowager, at the room's center, stood with her fan at the height she always held it, and her expression passed through several stages in the space of 5 seconds: calculation, recognition, and then something that was not quite humility, but occupied the same territory, and she looked at her son's face and saw what was there, and the confidence that had been infrastructure shifted and settled into something smaller and more honest. "The gray cloak," Richard said, still holding her hand, still entirely public about it, "has been the most visible thing in every room you entered this season. I am aware I am perhaps the last person to have told you so." Cecily looked at him. "You are not the last," she said. "Thomas knew." Something moved through Richard's face at that, quick and deep and not entirely composed, the specific expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had needed to know and had not asked for, because asking would have required him to admit he needed it. He held her hand a moment longer than the public occasion strictly required, and then, with the slight formal incline of the head that was his version of warmth made visible, he drew her toward the floor, and the musicians in the upper gallery, who had been watching with the professional attention of people whose livelihood depends on reading a room accurately, picked up their bows. Mrs. Prewett was not at the closing ball. She was at Ashvale, in the East Corridor, with the specific alertness of a woman who has sent information in one direction and is now waiting to see what it returns as. When the carriages came back through the park gates after midnight, she was the first to open the door. And she looked at the two of them as they came in from the cold, and she said simply, "I'm very glad, miss." And Cecily said, "Thank you, Mrs. Prewett." And something in the housekeeper's expression settled into the permanent position, the way certain things settle when they have been out of place for a long time and are finally, correctly, arranged. Thomas was asleep when Cecily looked in on her way upstairs. The nursery fire had been lit, which was not its usual condition, and in the firelight the room was warm and orange and slightly larger than it had seemed in the cold of the preceding weeks. He was curled on his side in the bed, and the wooden horse was on the pillow beside his face, and his hands were loose and open. The posture of a child sleeping without the specific muscular watchfulness that Cecily had come to recognize as the body's way of managing an uncertain world. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not wanting to disturb him, only looking at the ordinary miracle of a child asleep in a room that was warm enough. She heard Richard's step in the corridor behind her. He came to stand beside her in the doorway and looked at Thomas for a long moment without speaking. She did not look at him. She looked at the child. And after a moment she felt Richard's hand come to rest at the small of her back. A single point of warmth through the wool of her cloak, and she understood that this was not a small thing for him, and that he would not say so in these words, and she did not require him to. "He has been very alone," she said quietly. "Yes," Richard said. And then, after a pause, in which she could hear the precise weight of what it cost him to continue, "I have not known how to go back into that wing, until you left the door open." She looked at him then. His profile was toward the room, toward Thomas, and his jaw was set in the way it always was in public. but the rest of him was open in the way that rooms open when the windows are finally raised after a long winter. "The door was only half open," she said. That, he said, was entirely sufficient. In the weeks that followed, the practical world arranged itself with the efficiency that the practical world often achieves once the central decision has been made. The matter of Silas Hartwell's £420 was resolved quietly through the offices of Richard's solicitor, a man named Mr. Teal, who conducted his business with the discretion that distinguished the truly useful members of the legal profession from the merely adequate ones, and Cecily learned of it not from Richard directly, but from a short note Silas sent in early January, the handwriting a degree steadier than it had been in recent months. She looked at the note for a long time, and then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her gray cloak. Not because she needed to keep it there, but because the cloak had acquired, by that point, the quality of a garment that had witnessed a great deal and deserved to hold one more thing. The engagement was announced in the proper form and received with the mixture of genuine satisfaction and carefully managed adjustment that such announcements typically produced in a county that had strong opinions about the fitness of things and was now in the process of revising one of them. Lady Dorothea said very little in the weeks following, which was, from her, a form of acceptance. She attended 2 dinners at Ashvale in January, and on the second occasion addressed Cecily directly on the subject of the kitchen gardens, which was as close to an olive branch as the dowager's nature permitted, and Cecily accepted it with the grace of a woman who had not been ruined by the alternative, and saw no reason to make an adversary of a person who was simply, now, wrong about something she had been certain of for too long. Arabella Fenn went to Bath in February and was received there with the warmth her genuine qualities deserved, which was considerable. And she met a viscount's younger son in the pump room who had the specific quality of seeing her clearly rather than correctly, and she did not, in the end, require the Duke of Ashvale's particular form of recognition. Some people find the right room by not being let into the wrong one. By the end of January, Thomas had begun coming downstairs for dinner. It had not happened all at once. Richard had gone to the nursery on the Sunday following the closing ball, in the daylight, and knocked. And Thomas had opened the door and looked up at him with the wariness that had become the child's default expression. And Richard had said, "I thought we might look at the horses this afternoon, if you would like." And Thomas had held the wooden horse in both hands and considered this offer for a long moment, and then had put his boots on. It was, in its way, the most important conversation Richard had had in 4 years, and it lasted 15 words. January settled over Ashvale with the clean, unhurried quality of a month that has no performances left to give. The fires were well made, and the windows held the snow outside where it belonged. On an evening in the last week of the month, Cecily sat in the library with a book she was not quite reading, because the fire was warm and the snow was falling outside in the manner of snow that has no particular intention, and simply is, and the sound of the house around her had the quality she had been aware of in very few places in her life, the quality of rooms that know they are inhabited. Thomas was asleep upstairs, with the wooden horse on the pillow beside his face. Richard came into the library and sat down across from her without speaking, which was entirely consistent with his character, and looked at the fire, and after a moment, looked at her. And she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a comfortable interval that had nothing empty about it. The gray cloak was on its hook in the entrance hall. It would go on being gray and worn and exactly what it was, and the house around it was Ashvale, and the season was over, and she was not going home. She was already there. If Cecily's story moved something in you today, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest. Stories like this one endure because they find the listeners they were meant for, and knowing you are here matters more than you might expect.